Well, I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies here at the GSD and the Kennedy School of Government. I want to both thank you and congratulate you for being here today in this. We were talking earlier about the biblical weather that we're having with sheets of rain and horrible winds, so thank you for making the trek out here. I'm sure you will be very glad you did, because I'm really excited about the presentation, the conversation we're going to have here today. Before I talk about the event, a couple of announcements. We are having another event on Monday at noon in 109, right over here. We're having an event looking at the issue of community land trusts. And we have three different organizations that are going to be represented as part of that conversation. We have Mia White, who's on the faculty at the New School, who has done a lot of work around community land trusts in her own work, and we'll be kind of queuing up the conversation talking about the history of land trusts and their role in racial justice. And then we're going to have Eliza Parrott from the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative to talk about their work, and they're also starting to look towards a land trust model as well. And then lastly, we have Christy Peel and Leo Goldberg from the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, who are part of the new Interborough Land Trust in New York City. So we have three different organizations, three different perspectives on the land trust issue. I think really going to be an important conversation, so hope to see you back here on Monday. Other commercials, the Joint Center is in the process of making money available to students in various domains. There's the community summer internship program. We have a Myers Fellowship for PhD students. There's also a summer internship program for Kennedy School students. There's some information about all those by the door, so get your applications in. And then lastly, we've just announced an event we're doing on April 13th called Reframing Housing Development, addressing the problem of housing costs through design, construction, and regulatory innovation, which is going to be a half-day event on a Friday the 13th. Hopefully no bad luck associated with that, from 1 to 5:30 in the afternoon. Really interesting lineup of speakers from practice in each of those domains that I think is going to make for, and we're structuring the event too so that there's going to be opportunities for conversations as we go. So we'll have presentations and a chance for people in the room to get together and share their observations, share their views back through social media in a way that'll kind of make it a broader conversation. So hope you can join us for that one as well. And that one you have to register in advance, so go to our website, I think the GSD website, and you can register for that half-day event. David, any other commercials? And the Dunlop Lecture. So on April 10th, we are having the Dunlop Lecture is a lecture we've been doing every year for 18, 19 years now. And this year we're using it to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. We're very excited to have Raphael Bostic, who is currently the president of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank, previously a professor at USC, also previously the Assistant Secretary for Policy and Development Research at HUD during the time when the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule was put out, and also a Harvard alum, a Harvard undergrad alum. And so Raphael will be here to talk about the past, present, and future of fair housing to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. That's on April 10th. I think that's all for the commercials. I don't want to use up any more of our time today. I'm really excited to have both Mark Joseph and Amy Khare with us. These are two of the folks doing some of the most thoughtful and innovative work around helping to foster inclusive communities, mixed income communities in the country. Mark is a professor, associate professor at Case Western, and the director of the National Initiative on Mixed Income Communities. I got the name right. Amy is assistant professor of research at Case Western and also the research director at the Institute. Really, I think one of the things about their organization, and we were talking to them this morning, that I really find compelling is that they are not just academic researchers, but they're trying to then also be engaged in putting those ideas into practice through a consulting work and also influencing policy. And so I think the challenge, for academics is how to make your work change the world for a better way, and that's really what they're trying to do. And they're not easy worlds to bridge, and I think they'll talk a bit about that as part of their presentation this morning. Our motivation for having them come here today is manifold. One, I think, is just the growing recognition, the importance of how place matters. Certainly Raj Chetty's work has pointed to the importance of place. A host of other social science research is really dedicated to this question of what the environment that you live in affects so much of your life, current well-being and your future well-being. And it's a challenging question because oftentimes that gets translated into how do we get people out to opportunity, which then doesn't speak to the question about what those communities they come from and what becomes of them. And so I think their work speaks to this question of how do we take care of and foster the development, the resiliency, the improvement of those areas of concentrated urban poverty, and have a holistic view of the metropolitan area as well. And so I think that conversation about the importance of place and what do we do about it is really significant. The other piece is a smaller piece, though, is also view this conversation in context with Mayor Rahm Emanuel's visit a few weeks ago. And part of the motivation we had in bringing them was we wanted to have a sequence over the course of the semester that picked up threads of that conversation. And Chicago is a place where the transformation of public housing has been a major initiative, and certainly not without controversy. The mayor did not end up speaking much about that, perhaps for good reason. But Mark's own work has done a fair amount looking at the transformation of public housing in Chicago, which is certainly many lessons, unfortunately perhaps many lessons. And so I think a piece of what he'll talk about too is that work in Chicago and tie back to some of our conversations with the mayor. So I've blathered on too long. Let me turn it over to both of you folks for the presentation. We'll have a Q&A at the end, so definitely save up your questions and be ready. So I don't know, Mark, Amy, which one of you is starting?
We're going to actually come jump up and stand. We're moving around people. We're going to try not to make it too tough on your videographer back there, your IT team. Feel free to yell at us if we move too much. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Really thrilled to be here. And great to be back on campus. So I'm Harvard class of 90. And it wasn't always great to be back on campus. When I left in 90, I kind of rushed out of here. It was tough being a black man in Boston in the 1980s. I hope it's better being a black man in Boston today. But Boston's changed so much as a city. In the 28 years since we were here. So it is great to be back. Great to be at the School of Design. So thank you, first of all, to Chris and the folks at the Joint Center on Housing, also David, and the School of Design for hosting us. Is Paige here? I didn't get to meet Paige, so Paige has handled all the logistics, and it's been wonderful. So thank you for that. Also want to acknowledge, come on in, folks, come on in. No problem, come on in. Another member of our team, Taryn Gress, is the strategic director at the National Initiative, and she was there in the very, very beginning. I sketched this idea out on a napkin to her, and for some reason she agreed to join to try and make this happen 5-6 years ago. And here we are. She has family in the area, grew up in the area, so she used this as a chance to come check us out and check in on family, which is great to have you here. Other colleagues as well. So we have a number of colleagues who have joined, so we appreciate that. Thank you each. And also partners and developers who we're working with in the field are here in the room as well, so we're very appreciative. One last note on a couple special guests for me. My wife, Meilani, is here, and Meilani is a proud MIT grad. Somehow we overlap. She's class of 92, so there were these two. We talk about like between 90 and 92. We're sure we passed each other like au bon pain, and like felt energy in the air, but didn't know what happened. We met in Chicago in 92, the fall of 92. So glad that she's here. And also, speaking of Harvard class of 90, two other members, my roommate, Roger Berry. There were 4 of us freshman year, then there were 6 of us, and then there were just 2 of us, me and Roger, and then 2 of us. So for the 4 years, this guy put up with me, and we had a wonderful journey. And the fact that he's here, and his wife Sonia has joined us. Thank you, Sonia, for being here as well. And then our Winthrop House housemate, Andrew Richmond, is here, who was also in Wigglesworth his freshman year. So 4 years as well with Andrew. And to show what kind of friend this guy is, he also surprised me Monday coming out to Cleveland for 24 hours to be a part of an event there that was happening. And here he is again. So clearly we need to help him get a little bit more of a life. but he's also very supported. I want to give Amy a chance to say some upfront words, but Dr. Khare has just joined us officially as research director and research assistant professor January 1. So Amy and I have worked together for 15 years. She was very much she was the director, I was like, a part of our Chicago study. She was the director of our Chicago study that started back in 05, 06. So we've had a long journey together, but she's now joined us. And really this event gave Amy and I an opportunity to really sit down. And what you're gonna see here, first time we're presenting some kind of blended ideas about our next steps. So I'm so glad you could be here. Chris, thank you for making this work. And Amy, any opening words?
Just a couple of things as well. I think it's a mark when your mentor, my Mark, decides to include you in an event that he could have taken the stage for. So a sign of walking the walk of equity and inclusion is an ability to stand with. And I just want to thank you for including me, and thank you, Chris, and others that Harvard was willing to also suggest that an emerging scholar could be on, share the voice and the team. So in terms of also just real quick personal connections, I got my start as a community organizer and community builder, social worker, and so I've got friends that were really a big part of my teaching, one of whom is in the room today, Ayala Livni, who really helped me during my journey and my time in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I was doing some really hard work of building and creating supportive housing communities. And also Rachel Schmidt, who I've seen grow up and who has seen me grow up as a mom trying to struggle with graduate school, 3 kids, and in need of a home. And she and her family really provided that home for me so that I could be in a space where I could actually become a scholar. So I'm happy to be here today and to share with you some of what we've learned over the years, and include you in the conversation afterwards about what we can learn from you.
Great, so thank you for having us here. This is very meaningful to us. We will jump right in. We're gonna let Bart Mitchell come on in. Hey Bart, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Another developer friend.
CEO of the Community Builders. We're glad you're here, thank you. All right, so we've got a lot we want to cover, but we want to get through it in enough time to open this up for conversation. So we're going to give some background. We want to review where we've been, and then we want to talk about where we're going. And again, this is our first chance rolling it out, so we're really looking for feedback, questions. What isn't clear? Where are we crazy? Where are we missing the boat? So we're going to put you all to work on that. The starting point for us, and the way our country moves, it just makes this more and more and more true, that we're at this questioning moment of who are we anymore as America? I mean, who are we? How did we get here? And who is America? Who gets to be that? Who decides that? How is that going to work? And as we keep diversifying, because that's probably not going to stop, how are we going to work through that? So these are big existential questions for our country. What we're very excited about is that we've got a niche within that, this question of mixed income communities, where we get to explore those issues in a way we can get our hands around, and in a way we can hopefully learn some things that then we could take out to the broader America to say, this is how people who are different from each other live together in a durable, respectful way. We're going in the wrong direction right now. I don't have to tell any of you that. So it just makes our work more and more important. So a few questions that drive our work. How do we decrease concentrated poverty? But the flip side of that, like, what are we trying to build? And we're trying to build and sustain economically and racially diverse communities. How do we do that, right? These are fleeting, these are precious, these are very hard when you see them. They tend not to last. So how do we make them in a way that lasts? This is an actual block in Cleveland, we'll talk about it in a little while, but that we are working with. In the middle there you see JR. Who is our resident liaison for a participatory action research project. How can his block of neighbors connect with each other across race even more?
And kind of another trajectory of work that we're exploring is about the relationship between the public sector and the private market, and really calling into question how we can best use the private market and the various forms of investment and development for social good. And how can we promote also more equitable action in policy systems and markets? So when we see public sectors that are increasingly taking on kind of private market initiatives, how might they do so in ways that also promote social justice?
Amy referred to herself as an emerging scholar, but she really is a full-blown scholar. I mean, got her PhD just a couple years ago, but had been involved in research many, many years.
I was actually the first research subject in Mark's first study.
This is true.
So I was on the other side of research.
This is true. That interview was so tough. She's like, I want to be on the other side. I don't want to be answering questions. But as she mentioned before that, she had a really robust career as a practitioner. And so she's been on the developer side. She's worked for the Heartland Alliance for Housing, right? She's done this work. And so these questions that you see here are not questions that we've been raising, and are questions that her joining us is now going to allow us to answer in serious ways. And you're going to hear about her book, and I won't steal her thunder, but the next great book on Chicago is on its way. So who are we? How do we do this? The national initiative you've heard about, we've got these 4 areas of work. This is what I sketched on the napkin for Taryn. It's held up remarkably well over time. And we're working on an endowment, so we will be, if all goes well and we raise a little bit of money, be the Louis Cynthia Stokes Center for Equity and Inclusion, which really broadens our frame and allows us to stay the test of time long after Amy and I have moved on. This is how we look now, right? So what I just showed you was our center at Case Western, but in order to have the kind of reach and the impact we want, we formed a couple major national partnerships. And so in the blue box, you see us in the middle there. On the blue box is our consulting arm. You heard Chris mention that. We call it Triple Aim Impact Consulting. And it's in partnership with some real experts in community building work. And so we've partnered with them, formed this joint venture to be able to bring their techniques and methods into mixed income housing developments. And we're having a blast doing it and getting ourselves in lots of trouble. And then in the yellow box is our policy alliance. It's called the Mixed Income Strategic Alliance. It's with a practitioner group out of St. Louis, Urban Strategies, one of the largest human capital groups in mixed income communities. They're working in like 23 mixed income communities around the country. They partner with McCormick Barron in a lot of those places. And then the Center for the Study of Social Policy in DC, major, longstanding policy group. So the alliance is a practitioner, a policy group, and an applied research center, saying how can we combine forces to really move mixed income policy forward. One of the ways, 85% of our work is going to be this Mixed Income Innovation Action Network, which is going to be a peer support network among mixed income sites that are ready to go to the next level. And we're having our first meeting of sites next month, or actually later this month, March, since we're in March now. How do we get to March, by the way? Can anyone tell me that? Yeah, so that's that. Quick glimpse at where we are working, trying to make true on being a national initiative. So we've got Amy traveling way too much. Husband's not happy at either she or me at this very moment, but we'll keep moving. All right, so this is what didn't exist about a week ago, and that Amy and I, it's just maybe in our heads, but we really started to frame out for you all. So where are we headed? Our North Star of our work is urban equity and inclusion. That's what gets us up in the morning. That's what we worry about when we go to sleep at night. And that's what we're going to do for the next however long in our lives, right? So there's some pictures. The starting point, one of the starting points, is concentrated urban poverty as a problem. And everyone in the room would know why there's reams and reams of literature on why that's a problem. So what we've been doing for almost 15 years now is looking at mixed income development as a way to get from concentrated urban poverty to urban equity inclusion. What we plan to do is now broaden out and think about mixed income communities more broadly, beyond intentional development, so different types of mixed income communities. And we want to focus in on 3 particular areas of that, and in a moment Amy's going to tell you more. Operating culture shift within those working on it and living in mixed income communities, the question of social dynamics within these communities, and the question of upward mobility. So we'll come back to that. We're adding 2 new strands in the coming years, and one is right now, inclusionary development, and this is in partnership with Shoman Shamsuddin of Tufts University, who's here. Thanks for being here, Shoman. So really the 3 of us are building out a conceptual framework. We've always been interested in inclusionary housing, inclusionary zoning, as a much bigger policy arena in which to do mixed income community work. And so we're going to be focusing on that. Amy will tell you more about that in a moment. And then much broadly, and this really is Amy's push, is let's think about equitable systems, policies, markets at a larger level. So we're going to be moving in that direction. And we're going to be thinking not only about concentrated urban poverty, But about the flip side, exclusionary communities. And Amy's work and some stuff she's already done shines a spotlight on that part of the problem. Why do we have concentrated white affluence in certain places, and what are the dynamics there? So we'll tell you more about that. And we're going to wrap that all in a much more explicit racial equity and inclusion lens. Race has always been important to our work, and we've written about race, but never explicitly integrated it from kind of beginning to end in our work, and we're going to take that up and tell you a little bit more about that.
Okay, this next set of slides gives you a little bit of more of a picture of some of what we've produced to date. So we have research taking place all over the country. So we're not just a Chicago-based kind of research entity anymore, but rather our work is spanning across cities and across different types of communities. So you can just quickly look at the list here of some of the work we've done, and this is available on our website. Next slide, this gives you a sense of some of the consulting work. So as Chris said, we are spending time on the road in communities. We're embedded within organizations and within neighborhoods where people are seeking to answer some of the same questions we are. They're trying to answer those questions, though, from the standpoint of what do I do on Tuesday morning? When I get to work and I'm trying to do, my tenant screening a different way, so that I'm screening in residents rather than creating more barriers for them to get housing. So we have been recently, we've been in Austin, Texas. We spend a lot of time in San Francisco on the HOPE SF public housing transformation work in DC, embedded there in the 4 different mixed income public housing transformation projects in Cleveland and Pittsburgh. So this gives you the book cover of the project that Rob Chaskin and Mark Joseph and I worked on for many years. It's a 6-year qualitative study that really revealed an important finding, and that important finding relates to something we're going to be talking about today, and that's incorporated exclusion, which is the physical integration that reproduces marginality and leads to withdrawal and alienation rather than engagement and inclusion. And what we mean by this is that we can create housing units within buildings and within blocks where we intentionally have a strategy that is about how do we create more income diversity and housing tenure diversity, but that strategy actually led to more withdrawal and alienation. And so it did not produce the kinds of social benefits that we were hoping to achieve in Chicago. We're going to be coming back to that term.
I know what Bart Mitchell is thinking right now. He's thinking,
okay,
but it wasn't done. You guys' book was written partway through, and you're right. It wasn't done yet. So book was written 7 years in. It's a 15-year, and one of the things Bart's been talking to us about is you guys should go back and see how it is now. So just to read your mind for a second.
Yes, and just so you know, Bart Mitchell, his one of the sites was featured in the book, the Oakwood Shores. So we also in that study understood the perspectives not only of the low-income housing residents, but also the residents that were living in some of the affordable tax credit units, and also the homeowners that were market rate units. So people across the incomes and race perspective. So what happened in Chicago, and why is this kind of an important book for our field and an important set of findings for us to get to? We saw stunning physical transformation of the neighborhood. So the neighborhoods went from being incredibly physically isolated and crime-ridden to neighborhoods that you would drive through and not know that 10 years prior they were places that where shootings were happening on a weekly basis. So lots of neighborhood transformation. We also saw a housing authority that was going through a major transformation of a new way of operating from a public housing authority that had very few kind of expertise to now a housing authority that's declaring a victory with over 25,000 replacement units. We've got to kind of look underneath that as to were those all replacement units? Not quite. But that's certainly where they're headed, is kind of declaring this a victory. The mixed income momentum was severely stalled by the Great Recession. This was findings that were in my dissertation and forthcoming book that's called Privatizing Chicago, really tells the story of how, when we depend on the market to provide for housing and social goods, we're putting ourselves in very precarious situations, because what we've done is we've created a situation that over time may not be sustainable. So in times of recession, or in certain types of environments that are more market depressed, we are not able to build and expand affordable housing. So what's happening now in Chicago, Mayor Emanuel has, as Chris said, does not take hold of the public housing transformation as a project that he is continuing to promote, but rather is sidestepping much of the success that's been done to date, and is not heavily investing in the kinds of projects that they once invested in. And so we've got acres and acres of vacant land next to the new mixed income communities, waiting to be developed and not yet appropriated in terms of its plan for the next step. And we definitely are coming out with an agreement that the plan for transformation ultimately failed to reach its goal, which was to create a sense of unity and integration across incomes and across races in the city. Well, yes, so what's next up? My hard work over these years is really going to be the next book that's written on this topic, Privatizing Chicago, which critiques both mayors, Mayor Daley and Mayor Emanuel, for being standing by a more globalized city agenda that in many ways discounts the needs and rights of the most marginalized population, primarily African Americans.
Coming to a bookstore near you in 2019. Yes, Amy? 2019?
Yes.
Say it. You're on camera.
2019.
Okay. You, camera guy, did you get that?
Damn it.
Okay.
Damn it. Nothing like your mentor trying to get you to get your work done.
Because I'm holding back on other stuff until you get that book done. All right. Just to make sure we're all on the same page in the room, because we're going to talk a bit about mixed income. What is it, right? You've been talking about mixed income development. So in case you haven't heard, here's a very quick look. Because there's a particular intervention here. Public-private partnerships, as you've heard, often public housing demolition, relocation, and a sense of resident choice, right? This is opening up an opportunity. Do you want to move and do something else? Do you want to come back? Do you want to move to another type of public housing? New urbanist design, if you're familiar with that. Here we are at the Graduate School of Design, and there are some fascinating questions about design, so I hope that we'll come back to that. Mixed income, mixed tenure, Rachel Bratt, everyone who doesn't know Rachel Bratt, Dr. Rachel Bratt, recently retired from Tufts, asked a question about ownership earlier when we were talking, and ownership comes in, right, because some of these developments are not only blending within rental, but trying to blend in for sale. That's when stuff gets really interesting, when you're trying to put owners and renters sometimes in the same building. Come back to that. Mixed finance, when you talk to certainly some of the feds and others, they actually call this mixed finance, not even mixed income or mixed, because so much of this is about how you mix the financial streams and layers. Another fascinating component. So we could shift over to the business school and talk about the mixed finance side of this. Stringent tenant screening, vigilant property management, highly policed environments, hundreds of security cameras, right, tend to be part of the approach. Some pre-occupancy social services before folks move in, some after, but I think everyone would agree, not enough. The resources haven't been there to the extent they need to be. And then varying approaches to governance and community building. Who has voice? Who has influence? Who engages? All right, so given that intervention, the question we often get asked is, how's it going? Has it been successful? And the thing we often say, which makes us seem like those pain-in-the-butt scholars, would be, what do you mean by success, right? What do you mean for it to work? And part of the empirical work we've done is getting folks to answer to us, right, inductively, what do you think this is? And the thing that we've discovered is, and we could do a test here, right? We've got Elizabeth Suarez-Gonzalez and Bart Mitchell of the Community Builders. So we could add to each of them, but Elizabeth works on the community life side. So she's thinking about residents and she's thinking about community. Bart's thinking about residents community too, but he's got to make the thing pencil out. And he's also going to think about where it fits. So when you ask each of them, and we've done this hundreds of times now, even people on the same team have a different definition of success. Let alone all the partnerships that are involved. Let alone the mayor versus the developer versus the residents, right? So if you're all working on this together, but you have a different definition of success, how are we gonna reach the same endpoint? So what we've done is pulling all that together, synthesized for you, for the field, one framework for mixed income success, and all we suggest is this doesn't have to be the one, but start the conversation here. And so TCB can go back, sit down with your executive team, like, okay, what do we think? Do we agree with these 6 things or not? Right? So we're not saying it's the one, but we're trying to help the field have one conversation. All right, so what are the pieces? You want to change the site, the public housing site. As Amy said, crime-ridden, a lot of challenges, a lot of beautiful things happening there as well. So let's be really, really careful. Again, I thank Dr. Bratt. She kind of pulled our coattails a little bit here. And Dr. Larry Vail is in the room too, has been a foremost scholar of public housing, but reminding us to not demonize public housing, not fall into that everything is bad about it, or everyone is bad in it. Super important. But no one should have to live in those conditions. And so you want to change the site. You also then want to change the neighborhood, right? So you're not trying to change a site, but you're hoping if we can change this site, then the neighborhood itself is also going to turn around. You also want to avoid displacement. As we change the neighborhood, can the folks who've been there for 30, 40 years, generations, stay and enjoy it, right? It's not a success if we push everyone out. We want to attract and retain new folks to come in, and we want to retain the folks who are there. And then we're not just building mixed income housing, many of us, and certainly the community builders, and POA is also represented in the room, Patricia Belden's here from POA, would be very clear that we're also trying to build mixed income communities, right? So social inclusion, how is the social inclusion happening within these communities? And finally, this is also a people strategy. Ultimately, we're doing all this so that people have better lives, have better trajectories. And so success would be that there's upward mobility for all residents, low-income households, but all residents gain. All right, so how are we doing? We would say on site change and neighborhood change, pretty much A+. I mean, we're just killing it. I mean, the transformations, you just take people, you couldn't believe where you're standing if you'd been there 10 years ago. I mean, just go look at Chicago, go look at really any city now. So these two have been successful. Where it starts to get to be a mixed picture would be displacement, because we've seen very low return rates. The median rate of return in the Hope 6, those of you familiar with Hope 6, mixed income program that went for 18 years. And with Larry Vail, we were able to run some retrospective analyses. Showman was involved too. Median rate of return about 18%. So 18% of families got to come back and enjoy the new development, right?
So some people are wondering, should that be red?
You're right. I mean, it's mixed. Yeah, that would be a good point of conversation. And then from the neighborhood as well, right? As the neighborhoods turn around, folks aren't able to stay in them. We also think it's a mixed picture in terms of attracting and retaining, right? So I guess I could talk about the retaining point there. But here, some success, in fact, some incredible success at attracting market rate renters and buyers to places, sides of town where they would not have been seen years earlier. But then do they stay? Right? If this is ultimately about community building, you don't want them to kind of move in and churn, and we're seeing churn among market rate renters. Market rate renters churn anyway. So should we hold developers to a standard of having them not churn? Well, yeah. I mean, if this is going to work and you have a churning population, we got to figure out how to keep them once they're there. So build it and keep it so it's so awesome that no one wants to leave once they're there, right? This remains the continued unfinished business of mixed income. What keeps us up at night? Social inclusion. Really, really hard. And as Amy talked earlier about incorporated exclusion, so the extent to which when we get to sit down with residents, and after they've given us the tour of their unit and showed us the amazing bedrooms and look at my view and look at the building and look at the landscape and the pizza guy will come deliver and I can tell people at work where I live with pride and I can let my kid run outside. These are all massively important things. But then when the talk turns to how do you feel about living here? Well, here's what my neighbor said to me. Here's what my neighbor said to my kid. Here's what happened when I went to the community policing meeting and all of a sudden realized, wait, they're talking about me and people like me in vitriolic language. Don't take our word for it. Just Google anything we've written or has been written about us in a newspaper and look at the comments. And you will literally cry. I mean, it's just an indictment of our society. how people react to the notion of mixed income development. So the social inclusion point. And then finally, upward mobility, we would get a C, D, F. We've got a long way to go as we have an opportunity to go back to developments and do surveys. Alex Curley is in the room somewhere. She's done some of this work, right? Asking people in mature developments, how are you doing? And folks are telling them about running out of food before the end of the month, and falling behind on their rent. And this is after living in a mixed income development for years. So we have a lot of work to do. Last couple things I want to say before handing back to Amy for where we're headed. We got a bunch of stuff going on. I want to just highlight two particular things, one really big and one really small, to give you a sense of the scope of our work. So this is the really big one. This is our Mixed Income Innovation Action Network. Here are the 4 co-design members who we've invited to help us co-design the network for the rest of the folks who will join it. And so as I mentioned, we're having our first meeting later this month with 3 of these. The representative is the Housing Authority Director, and one of them, it's a local foundation person and someone from the director of the city planning department. But we hope we'll build out teams so that when we bring these folks together, you'll have the housing authority, the city, the developer, the property manager, the resident service provider, resident leaders, and others as part of that team thinking about the next level of this work. And so one of the things we're asking, in order to be a co-design partner, it's like, could you bring that group to the table? Like, what's the status of that right now? So we're really excited about that. We hope that this network will both become an exemplar in terms of each of the members taking the work to the next level to demonstrate what's possible, but also become a policy advocacy body, right? And as HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development, steps back from a kind of leadership and innovative role in this space, someone's got to step in and continue to hold the feet to the fire. A lot of these developments are partway through. So we're hoping this group will be a good, strong advocate for staying the course. Not that mixed income development is the silver bullet, because it's not. Not that it's the only way. But and it's debatable, but we continue to think it's worth continuing to invest in as one of the ways, one of the quivers we should have, or one of the arrows we should have in our quiver. Finally, very small, we have a project in Cleveland on 2 blocks, 2 street blocks, because we're really curious on how does this stuff happen, just play out on a regular, everyday block. Now, the blocks aren't regular and everyday in the sense that they are diverse, so we picked very carefully. And they had a resident leader who was like, participatory action research? Sounds interesting. I'll join a project and be a resident researcher. So we have 2 blocks where we're doing that. We're loving this project. I wish I could just clone myself and have one of me just only do this every day. There's plenty to do. We're hanging out on the blocks. We're thinking with neighbors what they do. And we're like, okay, movie night. How would you do movie night so that you have people of different races and classes actually engage with each other? How do you redesign your block party? So that folks don't just cluster in their cliques, right? Really cool stuff, and we're hoping that's going to generate useful things moving forward. So where are we headed, Amy?
Where are we headed? So as you recall, we kind of stopped at this, right here, where the arrow was at mixed income communities, and that was really that idea. We built units, we moved people in, we did the neighborhood transformation, and that's good enough. And we don't believe that's good enough. We believe that we've got to have a whole new way of approaching longevity and sustainability of this work over time, over generations. The first thing we want to do is problematize where we have been as a field, and that's been a focus on desegregation and integration. And that focus has led us to limit our way of thinking, but also limit our action, where we have not embraced necessarily a lens of racial equity. And in fact, what we've become more comfortable with is let's just build units side by side, or let's move people together, and somehow that diversity is going to be enough. And we believe, no, we've got to seek a different way of understanding what equity is. Equity is not equality. It's not about having people be on the same ground there. Instead, it's about providing resources in different ways so that the people who originally lived in these communities and who are on the wait lists of the public housing authorities waiting to come into a subsidized unit, that they have the opportunity to fully reach their aspirations and dreams. So this is a new way of approaching our work that's across all the different categories. So our first key focus, again, we have three areas of key focus that are going to extend. The first is on operating culture shifts. So those of you that have worked in nonprofit organizations and community development companies and in government, you know that it is incredibly difficult to move mountains. And that in fact, what happens is you become a bit of doing your job like it's been done all these years before and not really shaking the ground to make change. We are wanting to encourage moving from a culture that's been based on compliance, and many times that compliance is because of our federal policies, our LIHTC and our other policies that teach us who is in and who is out in terms of units. We're wanting to move from a compliance and a fear-based reality to a new culture that's about aspiration and hope, and where we can stop reinforcing the racist and classist stereotypes about people who are poor and about places that are poor, and that we move into a place of really valuing and understanding our what we can see as potential contributions. So some of the work that we're raising the question of is what are effective strategies that will help promote a new operating culture. And we've got projects taking place in some sites across the country that are encouraging conversations. So for example, we're working with Mercy Housing in San Francisco. Just recently, they've adopted a commitment to an equity and inclusion lens, and they put in front of us, and in front of themselves, which I compliment them for doing. They put in front of themselves their house rules for residents living in some of their housing units, and to review these rules and to really critique them, right? Of like, what message are we sending in terms of how people are supposed to behave, in terms of their house cleaning, in terms of how often they're able to go outside and make noise, where they're able to hang out on their stoop or not. These are the kinds of cultures that we're trying to shift. So we rewrite the rules of the house rules. We rewrite the tenant screening policies so that we can actually embrace a new way of seeing and the people and the places that are living in mixed income communities.
We with them.
We with them.
The bigger
yes.
we.
Let's be really clear that it was Mercy inviting us to have these conversations, these design sessions that are focused on how do we promote inclusion and equity within mixed income communities.
And just to bring it into the room, I mean, Elizabeth, we've got the Commodore building in Cleveland, and at a smaller level, that's the conversation we're having, right? What should the culture be? It's had one culture, one type of property management, one type of treatment by the surrounding community, and we're really trying to dig in on how do you use this redevelopment opportunity as a way to shift the culture. So TCB is a partner in this as well.
It's really easy to come out as academics and just critique what isn't working, but what we're trying to do is actually figure out how did we get to what wasn't working in terms of social exclusion and inequity, and how can we intervene earlier so that we can transform both our way as academics, but also as staff and as policymakers and as practitioners working in the field. Okay, the second key focuses on social dynamics. And here, again, we return to this idea of incorporated exclusion and how policies and practices within mixed income communities have led to an alienation and a marginalization that's really just recreated. It's the kinds of racism and classism that we're trying to solve for. So moving away from the us versus them and moving into a space of social cohesion, moving away from where residents are feeling isolated and quieted from their own sense of rights and perspectives to a place where they have voice and influence, and they feel actively participating as citizens in forming the community in which they live. Which
doesn't necessarily mean tenant councils.
Yes.
So that's part of, right? And we share with TCB, we're both like, oh, we're not feeling great about tenants councils. They're kind of surprised when we say that's not what we're talking about either. Those can be a really awful form of trying to get people to have voice and inclusion.
And we're with our partners at Trusted Space. We're actually engaged in some new ways of forming voice and power among residents living both in public housing and in mixed income communities. And then this idea of perpetuation of interpersonal and internalized racism, that even the residents themselves and the staff with whom we have partnered with hold a sense of internalized racism, and that's a hard thing to understand, to unpack, and then to actually shift the way that we create communities when something as difficult as racism is not necessarily always talked about by a public housing authority property manager. So what are some of the effective strategies to promote effective neighboring, social cohesion, and belonging? It's the new question that we're pursuing. A third key focus is promoting upward mobility, which we've already spoken about. We know that the housing and services model alone is failing. It is not leading to mental health and physical health outcomes. It's not leading to changes in income and employment. We need to
I have to say at an aggregate level.
At an aggregate level.
You can certainly point to people in a program, but if you talk about are we using these millions of investment and all the time and energy to shift a population, we haven't gotten there yet.
So we are primarily, we've seen what our results are showing, and others, in the room, their results have shown is that we've seen differences. We've seen some difference in kind of a sense of households who have a housing. They have housing stability, but they don't have economic stability, and they don't have a trajectory in which their children are going to see major changes like we saw in the MTO study with Rush Chetty. So can we actually believe that a mobility strategy that's been as successful as that one was could we see those same results in mixed income communities in 20 years from now, where the youth growing up in Oakwood Shores are actually going to be renting or owning at those market rate units at Oakwood Shores versus staying in a subsidized public housing unit. So we're interested in what might it take to shift the systems and programs and services so that we are really connecting our housing system to the labor market and to employers and to a whole new way of wealth building to really get at some of the racial wealth gaps that have been perpetuating poverty for years. So we've gotten through that long line. Now there's two other kind of arrows and to help us reach the North Star. So the first is on inclusionary development. Those of you that are familiar with inclusionary housing or zoning, especially here in Massachusetts, Massachusetts has been a leader in this field in which there has been incentives and mandates in some states for private developers to build affordable housing units in new developments. And it's been an incredible strategy for producing new affordable housing units. What it hasn't done is it hasn't, that we know of at least yet, because the research hasn't been done on this, to really show longer-term social and economic benefits for those residents who have moved into a unit that is been built through inclusionary housing and zoning. And in fact, there's been very little research of the whole field, and yet this is the new strategy. We know there's been a devolution of power from the federal government, from HUD in particular, to localities, to municipalities. Local jurisdictions are having more influence over their housing policies, and private market actors are having more influence over the built environment. They're having more reason to get involved in producing affordable housing, in some cases because they're forced to. And so the question is, can we use those inclusionary housing and zoning policies? Can we expand our thinking about them so that we are able to get them to move into a space of equity and inclusion? So they're not just about building units, they're about creating opportunities for inclusion and equity within the city and within spaces like this. So we are concerned about a preference towards certain areas, that being on that first slide that you just flipped out of, concentrated affluence and majority white spaces. This is spaces that we have preferenced over Black and brown spaces. We have said these high opportunity neighborhoods are neighborhoods that are going to create a different trajectory. We believe that's true in some cases, but equity is not on the agenda in these spaces. And so we're needing to figure out ways to see the overall economic cost to segregation and the increasing ability of these communities to create policies that continue to exclude. And some of my recent work on the cost of segregation, which was published this past year, and another report coming out in April, really shows that at a regional scale, regions that are more integrated by race and income are also regions where there is more cost savings and more economic health of overall prosperity of the whole region. So what can we do in these spaces? Next slide.
And just to mention again that Showman in the front row there is our partner on this. So if you have any questions on this slide, ask Showman. He's in a white shirt.
And in terms of gentrification and racially diverse spaces, this really is a concern that I think we all in this room share, and that is that are our housing policies just a tool for displacement? And if they are, then how might we make policy decisions differently so that low-income households are not only able to stay, but they're able to stay in ways that they have an increased sense of shared belonging and commitment. So really trying to understand how to increase opportunity within inclusionary zoning and housing policies so that we can have more racially diverse and economically diverse communities, but do so in ways that also are about equity. So the next and final vision here is that we've got to change our systems. That if we're talking about poverty, we need to also be talking about affluence. And we've got to be talking about how to change the systems that incentivize white people, primarily, who have traditionally had more opportunity for homeownership. We've got to figure out how to change those systems and policies so that there's more opportunity for lower income people and also communities of color to see more investment in their communities and for their households. So how do we get to inclusive metros? Just very quickly, we do it through integration, both at the neighborhood level and the regional level. We do it through infusing equity lens through our kind of systems of education, transit, housing. We do it through influence. So how do we create more democratic participation and voice for people at different income and racial backgrounds? And then finally, how do we create more spaces that are comfortable for shared dialogue, both within groups and across groups, so that people who have traditionally held positions of power and resource have an opportunity to learn about the negatives that they might be experiencing by living in such different systems, at the same time that people without those resources have the opportunity to share their resilience and their power and their survival that has led to a sense of strength for them. So not necessarily only seeing them as on the lower end. So I think that's that on that slide.
One final thing that we're going to open up for conversation questions is how do we take seriously this commitment to being serious about racial equity and inclusion? It's a topic that we often shy away from because it's such a hard topic to discuss. And it's one that when we do discuss it, we tend to discuss at a very high level. And we look at statistics and we look at, we're interested in going as granular as we can. What does this mean for each and every one of us? And as we've thought more and more about it, we think it really starts with a personal journey. We're all at different places in our comfort. And so I had an opportunity in October to do a talk in Cleveland about racial equity, and I really kind of forced myself, like, what would you want people to do tomorrow? And so what I want people to do is start using a racial equity lens and actually have one. Right? So if we had a show of hands right now, who has a racially equity lens that you use, you think about when you're making a hire, when you're designing a program, when you're doing a proposal? Not many of us have that, right? And what would be a racial equity lens anyway? So I built one out, and if you're interested, there's much more detail, but it has these three components: structure, perceptions, belonging. So if you can remember those three words, you've got a racial equity lens. And you want to ask about structural causes, not just what people are doing to people. What's the structural cause and what are the structural differences? And often we're doing that, or we're doing that more and more. I think we don't do the other two. Part of this is about perceptions. Part of this is in mindset. Part of this is the stuff embedded way into our hardwiring and our mental maps that we just play out every day. People see me on the street, and it's interesting when I see colleagues on campus who just, like I'm invisible, because they saw a black man walking along. And they don't see that many black men, so they put me in black man category, not Mark. Literally, it just happened last week. And I just marvel, just watch them. In fact, last week it was good because I was on the phone, and I saw this person coming who I know, and I was like, oh, shoot, I'm on the phone on a conference call, but I'm going to have to talk to this person. And then I realized, oh, he's going to do it. And he did it. He just didn't even look. It was like he saw me because he came by me this closely, but it was just, there was a black man walking who's not in his frame. That's deep. He's not a bad person. I want to quickly mention Micah Pollock's book because she was here when she wrote it. So if you're not familiar with everyday anti-racism, changed my worldview. After reading that book, I began calling myself a racist, which I hadn't done and this was only 6 years ago or something. We're all racist. Like, it's not like I'm not a racist, they're a racist. That's not the point. The point is we all are. The point is, are you an anti-racist? Are you taking steps, and the word I use is vigilance, are you taking those everyday steps to ask yourself, wait, there's a black man coming, hold on, I'm gonna rewire, and I'm gonna look twice to see, oh, it's Mark, right? But that takes work. So it's that kind of thing, and there's 100 times a day, you're doing something racist without meaning to do it, right? And so I'd like you to 100 times a day do something anti-racist. I think that's what it kind of takes. So that's perceptions, and then this belonging, an easy point to make under this current administration, because we now have an othering country. We're in the midst of othering folks, right? But we can't just sit there and complain about othering. You have to do belonging work. So how many property managers in these mixed income communities are thinking of their work as belonging work and looking at the house rules and saying, do these house rules give a sense of belonging? Or am I actually othering you by what the rules say about what it means for you to live here? That's not intentional. No one's a bad person, but it's perpetuating the system. So we're trying to drill down to that level. And real quick, one project we just launched. I'm sorry, you wanted to jump in.
I just want to say that on that note, it feels so heavy, and it is so heavy, so this should be difficult to share and reflect our own racism. But it's also a time of change. And so we actually have stories of where we're seeing changes in ourselves and changes in the people that we're working with, so that it's not impossible to adopt a racial equity lens and actually then make choices about where you shop and where you go see a movie, and the choices of who you invite into your home. Those are the kinds of decisions that we have power over.
Final slide here is a project we just kicked off on Friday, actually. So CNP, Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, is an intermediary in Cleveland, and they launched a year ago a series of racial equity inclusion workshops, which are 2 days and takes people through the history of how we got here. And it's just blown people's minds. And everyone walks out there going, what's next? What do we do next? How we apply this? So they've engaged with us, and this has been a long-time partner, to develop the metrics. What do we measure? Right? What do we want to ask about those 1,500 people, what they then go on to do? And there's some cool stories. I'll give you one quick example. I met with a guy in my office from one CDC, Community Development Corporation. They are creating a racial equity inclusion Seder around Passover. He's Jewish. And said, how do we use that dinner format and blend it with some of the issues to have a multicultural conversation in a community that was primarily Jewish, is now primarily African American. And that just came out of sitting in that workshop and going, what can I do? So how do we capture that and make that available to folks? So we will be doing that. Very excited about that project. With that, we will open up for questions. Facilitator's prerogative. Chris, we will let you, do you want to lead or we can pick from here?
Okay. I'm going to take the prerogative. I just want to ask kind of a high-level question to start, which is, you're leading the national, what's the I word? Initiative on mixed income communities. You noted that it's not the only way to achieve these goals. It's one way, but obviously you've dedicated yourselves to this way. And so I think it was part of the conversations we had this morning. But I think what's missing from this is your plea or your argument about why mixed income communities are an important part of that process. And you can talk about it has to do with social networks, it has to do with social norms, it has to do with access to public services. It could be related to that last slide, which it has to do with the public good of expanding dialogue across these groups that have social benefits. But for you, too, why? Why are you dedicating your lives to this? What do you see this? What's the mechanism you see achieving the goals you're trying to achieve?
So a personal answer is that I was 30 years ago now in Atlanta's Techwood Clark Howell Homes running a youth program. And all of a sudden the announcement went out that it was going to be transitioned to Centennial Place, a mixed income community. And so I sat with the families in that community and went from door to door to door with them saying, Mark, what's going to happen to us? What is mixed income? That's the first time I'd heard that term. How are we going to, what should we do? What choice should we make? And so that planted very deep within me. And it has not played out well for those families. Right? So that's a personal story. On another level, we don't have an alternative that has been proven to be tremendously successful. We have other approaches, so vouchers and go take a voucher, go live in the private market, tremendously problematic, right? If you look at that. We've talked about inclusionary zoning. We don't really know, but there's a sense, and something about mixed income for me gives a level of intentionality, an opportunity to really, I'm a place-based guy. And so it's part of the answer is that I think place is something to work on. And so how do we use place more effectively? So that fits with my kind of frame and strategic interest is using place. And I'm so deep in it now. Although, seriously, if someone could show me that vouchers were a better solution or something else and we should go study that, I'd be happy to kind of jump on board and support it. But Amy, what would you say?
Yeah, so I think from a personal standpoint as well, like some of my greatest teachers, are people who were deemed those who were without. So, you know, Mamie Bell in Cleveland, who was a bus driver, who taught me about how little I knew about poverty and so as somebody who's white, who came from an affluent background, who had professional degrees, I continuously have been held to the fire in the field as a practitioner by people who really helped me to see how little I knew. And I think actually mixed income communities is one of the few spaces where we have the opportunity to understand someone else's experience and have an idea of what it means to shift our understanding of what it is that is a shared human experience. And I think in terms of now, like, where are we as a policy in the policy realm? We are moving to privatization and financialization of housing policy. So if you don't know that already, get on board. The private market is becoming the dominant way to solve our public problems. And so how can we help support the education, the capacity, the expertise of bankers, of investors, of private developers who may actually be able to change the way they operate to have a more mission-driven approach like we've seen in the community builders and POA and Mercy and other private developers that are doing this model. They are the ones who we need to change some of the operating culture of. The investment system itself, the assessment, how we assess property. So I think it's only through personal connections that people actually are able to kind of shift their own way of thinking about their about policy. And so, but I agree with Mark, it is not a silver bullet solution. So putting it in perspective of a wider range of policy, a policy agenda is incredibly important. And so we have to be also looking at what needs to shift in our education system, what needs to shift in how we think about the labor market and the opportunity for people that are never going to get success with a college degree. That will end up with more student debt and be working at Starbucks. So, you know, I think it is one approach that has to be embedded in a wider range of policy initiatives.
And we do have a paper for those interested that looks at relocatees in Chicago 10 years on and compares those in mixed income developments, those in scattered sites, those who took a voucher, and those who went to 100% public housing developments. And we find that those who were doing best were in the scattered sites, which is intriguing. And those doing worse were with vouchers, and we found no difference between those in mixed income developments versus those who went to 100% public housing. which we found, and you'll find disappointing in some ways. So we have had some chances to look at that, and I think it's a very important, we were talking this morning, we need to do more of those kind of comparisons. Thank you. Patricia.
It's great to hear.
Do you mind introducing yourself? Sure. We've mentioned you a couple times, but just so folks know who you are.
So I'm Patricia Belden with POA Communities, and I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this work since we got involved in the first privately owned choice neighborhood grant in Chicago. So in 2008, we bought the Grove Park, which was 500 units of very distressed housing on the south side of Chicago. And so when we think about our mixed housing, one thing we think about is within our Section 8, we have a huge mix within that. You've got residents that are zero-income renters and residents that are earning 50% of area median income or more, if they came in below 50 and moved up from there. And I think there's a lot of good news with about a third of our residents in our Section 8 are working, and a third have been in and out, or total of another third have been in and out of the workforce within the last 12 months. So this economic mobility piece has some real chances to help investing in that, I think, to move people up a little bit of a continuum on the economic mobility. It's not always this big stretch like we think it is, and you guys know that piece. And then one of my questions is, when you think about how much have you thought about what level of mixing can work? So the idea of public housing with high-end market versus, which I think we're all sort of saying isn't working great. But there's a lot of gradations in there. And if you guys looked at which ones are working better than others, if we think about the word mixed income as having a lot of variety within it.
You want to take that first?
Yeah, so I think we have to start with what is mixed income, right? So we have a slide, we don't have it here today, but that really gives you a range of some buildings are 20% low income and 80% market rate rental high end. Other models are, a third, kind of very low income, moderate income, and then market rate renters. So what are we even talking about is important. And I think, Patricia, your question is what should the expectation be about how much mix should be expected and built? And I think we know that the range of the continuum from zero income to people that are purchasing $600,000 single family homes in the same block is not the model that's worked well. And that is the Chicago model, or the old Chicago model. Chicago's kind of adapted in some ways. I don't think we know yet how much of the spatial proximity, either within the building, can really be useful from a social standpoint with the right interventions. So we know with no interventions, you have no property manager who's kind of thinking about belonging, or you don't have a resident liaison who's thinking about how do we create opportunities for people to connect in the lobby in ways that are comfortable. If you have no intervention, then creating high levels of proximity is detrimental, and we would suggest that probably not to go in that direction. But I think we don't know high levels of proximity with the right interventions, the social supports. We might be able to actually see that as a possible model that works well for everyone on that block or in that building.
I've come to think more and more about a couple key variables to help answer that question, because I think the answer is it depends on the site. Mm-hmm. And I think the right answer is different for each and every site you're talking about. One variable is the context of the neighborhood. So are you building in a revitalizing area, north side of Chicago, right? Lathrop Homes, that's just taking off? Well, my argument is you gotta increase the proportion of mix of affordable housing and subsidized housing in that area. Because the development's gonna be fine, right? You've got market rate folks all around, but are you in a very risky area where you're taking a big leap? Right? And if you only have 20% market rate, like no one's gonna move and take. So neighborhood context. But the other one, and it's great to have developers in the room, is the developer. Mm-hmm. And I certainly, as I've matured in this field, it's like, what makes sense for that developer? What's that developer up for? What capacity do they have? What philosophy do they have? Where are they in their own racial equity inclusion journey? And allow them to be at different places. Right? So there's not one, because if you forced, and it's interesting, we could talk about Ickes is the newest Chicago Housing Authority development, the TCB, is doing, major development, super important after the 11 that have gone before it. The Housing Authority has said, you guys have to integrate units in every building. So they've decreed that.
And they've also decreased the number of affordable housing units that could be built on site from 800 units to now 200 public housing units.
And so there's a frame that you all are working within. So that goes against what I would say, which would be, let's let the developer decide. First of all, analyze the context, decide what they can do and pull off, both in terms of what they're ready for and the support and partners they can get. But in that case, here you are. You've got to figure out how to integrate it. And so now you need to find the partners who will help you figure out how to do that. So I think the question of mix is really, really very, very important. And we need to get better and smarter at how to help developers and housing authorities and cities make that decision in different places. One dream is that we would have some kind of mixed income simulation lab where you all could come to the table and we could feed in the data on here's the neighborhood context, here's what we've done, here's the type of mix, and then it could shoot out different options to you, and we could do some kind of simulation and say how we think, right, so that would be. So maybe the safe collaboration will pull together and put some money behind that. But yeah, it's a critical question, we need to do better.
Hi, my name's Ina. I'm a first-year planning student here at GSD. This might be a very basic question, but I think when you think of mixed income development, you guys have seen a lot of cases. Are you seeing what's like the percentage divide between, like attracting higher income family into a lower income community and the vice versa, having a lower income families coming into a higher income community? And can you talk about some of like the different strategies when to use for these two different cases? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I can tackle that more from a race-based perspective than an income-based. So we know from research that African American predominant communities are least likely to see integration happen, and that usually there's a threshold that kind of under about 60%, or if you have 60% African Americans or more or less, that you wouldn't see people moving in a natural market. That there has to be some sort of policy lever that would allow an increase, an incentive, whether it's location or it's affordability, that would kind of promote that level of integration. That's different for communities that have been predominantly Latino, where there's been more comfort around whites to move into those communities, and in fact, in doing so, create more challenges for Latinos to stay rooted. So I think that may help a little bit, but on the income side,
I just want to make sure you're familiar about the different policy arenas, because you're asking about the answer to your question is there are big policy arenas around each, and our arrows kind of represent that. So when you talked about affluent folks moving in to a community, that's what we refer to as mixed income development. So Hope 6, choice neighborhoods are ways to do that. That's that middle arrow. When we talk about folks moving into affluent communities, you can do that through inclusionary development, which is a much larger policy arena, right? Maybe 10 times as big in terms of the numbers of units. But then if you add to that the voucher strategy, so if you're familiar with housing choice vouchers, which enable people, again, much larger approach. So the answer to your question was far more in terms of people affected in that broader strategy, which leads to the question Larry Vail keeps asking us, like, why are you spending so much time focused on the little one when there's the bigger one? Which is a great question, and if we had 88 hours in a day, we would love to do it all. We've made our niche in that little one because we think it's part of an existential question, and we can answer it in an effective way. But there needs to be research on all of those levels, and there is a good critique, which is in some ways, funders and others are more interested in the mixed income development approach, right? It's a shinier, sparklier, you can take a tour of a mixed income development, right? That's a problem. So we certainly agree with that, and to the extent that we can help bring the message that there needs to be research on both sides, we'd be happy to do that.
and there also is really strong public housing communities and low-income communities of color that need more development and capital to thrive, and don't need more white people or need more higher income people to thrive. So, I think that there is something to be said about developing, strong communities regardless of who lives there.
Hey guys, Nick.
Hey, Nick.
Hey, how's it going? Nick from MIT.
Union's happening in this room, by the way. Students and former professors. It's really cool to see.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey everybody. I'm Nick Kelly I'm a PhD student at MIT. I've worked a bit with you guys on Hope 6 stuff. So I was really interested in you bringing in the racial equity and inclusion lens into mixed income communities. It's not something I'm usually familiar with, that combining those two frames. I want to just push you guys a little bit on that. So it seemed like when you were talking about racial inclusion, you were more talking about on the personal level, that kind of study you did with how individual perceptions were changed through education. But what is your sense of how much mixed income development on its own can actually lead to racial inclusion, especially given that you showed that on all your metrics, that's the most difficult way to succeed in terms of mixed income housing. So why is mixed income housing the best way to achieve racial equity and inclusion when there are all these other, there are other possibilities? And also a kind of follow-up question to that is, some of the research I've read has shown that if you use a racial equity frame, while it may be a kind of just and good way to do it, it actually makes such programs more unpopular. I think there's been a study kind of showing comparative work between like Denver and Minneapolis on fair housing advocacy, and they found that the Denver used a fair racial lens and it was much less successful, whereas Minneapolis used an affordable housing lens and it was more successful in promoting housing. So I just wanted to kind of push you guys on this new frame, which I think is exciting, but potentially difficult. I want to hear your thoughts on it.
So, Nick, if you heard me say that mixed income development is the best way to promote racial equity and inclusion, I apologize, because I in no way even believe that necessarily. I have to think about if I think it's the best way. I would reframe it into say, we don't think we win, whatever winning would be, through mixed income development without putting a racial equity inclusion lens. You might find an easier way to do it. You might find it more palatable in Minneapolis. You may get more people to vote for it or get the mayor on board. You're not going to get where we're trying to get unless you name, because racial equity and inclusion, or inequity and exclusion, is such the core of the problem, 500 years worth, that if you just focus on what will be palatable in a survey and design policy that way, you can do that. We're doing that. So I'm not trying to be overly critical or cynical. I'm really, for the rest of my career, trying to think about what's the best way to get to where we really want to go. And so you're right. It's going to be hard and uncomfortable. What's exciting is we've got developers. I mean, Bart Mitchell, Patricia haven't run out of the room yet, right? And we've been talking, we said racism many, many times. These are things we're saying, right? We're saying that we're in a position to say this to mayors, to say this to developers, to say this to, and we're in a moment in our country where folks are a little more primed to it because this othering is more of a dinner table conversation, so it would have been harder years ago. When we start at the personal, again, I push myself to like, what would really work? I don't think it works to start at for those familiar with AFFH, right? Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. There are going to be these roundtables in each region. They're going to look at data. We'll see what the current administration does with this. They might kill it. But the plan is that there would be these roundtables, and maybe it'll come back. So we have to wait, right, for the next administration. Roundtables where groups get together in their region. They look at data, and HUD has built out a database so they can go and figure out what's the deal in our region. And then they would look at the data and come up with a plan. And it was actually sitting at HUD that this clicked for me as like, what would I have wanted to do with those 12 people before they sat around that table? Because I'm not at all confident that those 12 people have figured out what's going on in their own heads as they're thinking about what's possible. Where should we build housing? Where should we invest? And so they're sitting there with their current mental map. So for me, the personal journey is just a step so that when you do have those decision makers and those executives, they've done that work and they have a common language around this. Amy's point about thank you for getting the equity. Not everyone, what do we mean by equity, right? Are they even thinking it's the same thing? So the personal work is a precursor to the policy work, the system work, the other stuff. It's not that the personal stuff alone is going to help, but I think we're banging our heads against a wall if you've got people doing the other work without having started the personal journey.
I think the other thing that's important is thinking about the metro context. So there are some regions that are going to be more comfortable with an affordable housing campaign approach. And those are places where race is still not in the forefront of discussions, but where they might be, they're not there yet. And so, in fact, it could potentially do some harm to introduce racist policies at a table where the people who help create those policies are immediately shutting down and are immediately building a wall. So kind of how do you, at what time, in what places, and in certain regions, and being in Chicago right now, I mean, I'm not exactly in a hotbed of progressive policy, and yet we are uncovering some potential policy solutions to address racial equity, and we'll be releasing a report on April 10th that will specify 25 approaches for addressing racial equity, but we're not coming out all the time with that you have to be an anti-racist human being, but rather we're suggesting, is there a way that we can see our interdependency, the white affluent communities being connected and with the Southside Woodlawn community that has the Choice neighborhood. So, in what ways do we have some shared dependency so we can all be thinking about the best for the Chicago region? And that's in some ways, that's a more palatable approach for an environment like Chicago that is not necessarily going to be comfortable with a front and center racial equity lens right now.
Roger.
So Roger Berry, I guess I'm most famous for being Mark's old roommate, and which I'm proud of. First, just a small question. Have you looked at our neighborhood in Cambridge? And so what's around here? Do you have any data about success or failure?
No.
Yeah. So you've been to our house, and as I'm listening to you, I'm reflecting on our neighborhood and what works and what doesn't work. So we have significant public housing in the Walden Square apartments, just a little bit over that way, and then significant $1 million plus homes, on the other side of the street. And in what is working is our local school at the elementary level, I think, is working tremendously well. So our two kids, 6 and 8, in their class, probably 30 to 50% would be fairly low income, largely immigrant, significantly Muslim students, and there's a real melting pot. Our kids have friends who are look different, speak different, don't always come to all the birthday parties for some cultural reasons, but there's a lot of positive interaction. You challenged me, Mark, or you challenged my son a couple of years ago to have a black friend, and he's in high school at Cambridge Wrench, and that's a complete failure. So I think we've pushed him, but those communities the white and black communities at the high school level are brutally separated, and so something happens there. That I'm just putting out there so for reflection. Trying to think about a practical thing, I think the thing that makes, to the extent that our neighborhood really holds together, and it doesn't always, so we have a basketball court next to tennis courts. White people go, black people go. They don't necessarily on the same side of the fence, but they're in the same area, and there's issues we've talked about that break down. But the place where I think it works the best is the park. So we have Danahee Park, which was a massive investment 30 years ago, and we have soccer fields, we have baseball fields, and really you see Muslim, Christian, Jewish, black, white really get together in that park in the summer. And so I guess the second question to you is how much does that public infrastructure of public spaces really drive success or failure in these communities? Because and I'm not saying we're successful, but to the extent that we're successful, I think that park is really, really critical and makes a lot of this work.
It's huge. It's huge. And in the literature, we talk about third spaces, right? What's that other place? And a park is a great example, but coffee shops, there's many, and you've put your finger on it. And sitting again in the School of Design, there's a lot more thinking we can do to be intentional about how to get the most out of those spaces. So you're exactly right. And we need to learn more about communities like that, and that's what we hope to be shifting into, more organic. By the way, the public housing in Cambridge, so Greg Russ was a long-term director here. He's now in Minneapolis, and he's one of the reasons why they're one of our co-design partners. It's one of the best thinkers and experienced folks around public housing. When he got to Minneapolis and saw another canvas on which to paint, there's going to be some really excellent things he does. So there's a reason public housing works the way it does in Cambridge. Great point.
So I think we have time for one more question.
All right.
Or we could do rapid fire, take a couple questions just to get people to have a
And
chance.
then people at least hear the question even
Yeah.
if we don't. Yeah, that sounds good.
Hi, my name is Paula. I go to UMass Boston. I'm a senior. I was thinking about the upward mobility, just because I've seen kind of like a failure in that. And I watched the movie 70 Acres in Chicago, and they talked about homeowners who felt like they needed to move because the public housing around the area was not working for them. But then the lower income families had to stay, so their kids had to go to the schools that were just not equally funded, or the education was not as good. I was wondering if you or your partners have been thinking about upward mobility and how to interact that with the community and make school a priority, because school, especially in Latino and Black communities, we have higher dropout rates, lower enrollment in college. How do you? I think there's a strong intersectionality between housing and schooling, where you go to school and where you live. So have you guys done research on that, or thought about what you can work with partners on that?
All right, so hold on to that
Yeah,
one.
go ahead.
So there was another question here in the middle. We got to have a little equity and exclusion for this part of the room. So go ahead and ask your question.
I'm an architect in Boston. I don't do anything with housing, so I'm very not. This is not my day-to-day stuff. Have you done much research into how community is formed across different income levels?
Okay. And what over here in the blue, right in front of you?
Hi, my name's Hannah. I'm writing my thesis on homelessness and specifically the housing first model, which I find to be really important but lacking in this sort of social inclusion. And I've learned that 40% of the people who go to a day shelter in Boston are currently housed. So I'm wondering how the question about thriving in housing is something I've been asking both clients and policymakers, and I think everyone agrees that it doesn't include going back to your homeless spaces. But how does your model apply to people who are the hardest to house or are on the very margins of society?
All right, so we're going to make this nearly impossible. So Rachel Bratt has, and so this will be the last question.
So, the last question. Okay. This was great. I mean, we should really stop and pause for a minute and say thank you to you, because it was inspirational. In fact, I think I'm going to go into the field because it's so exciting. It's so exciting, and you guys should be thanked and praised a lot for this work and for the presentation. Just a very quick comment. I liked your, I guess it was a hexagon with the different elements that would constitute success. But one thing that seems to be missing is any word called housing. To what extent is mixed income housing actually providing decent, affordable housing? And to what extent is it providing people some agency over their housing? And to what extent is the housing providing some economic security in the moment? You said people are still struggling, but it seems like some pieces. And you would probably score pretty well on the decent, affordable housing, so you could give yourselves an A+ on that one too, because it is a mixed record. But the housing piece for a mixed income housing strategy seems to be underrepresented. Thank you.
All right. So and you have 30 seconds in which to reply to those 4 questions, but kind of briefly. So we got upward mobility schools. How do communities form? The hardest to house,
Yeah.
and housing.
We can do it. We got it. So, Rachel, the housing sits in the site space. So the problem with doing hexagons is then you carry over a lot of stuff words there. So transforming the site, the stunning physical transformation was all about housing, but broader than housing. So you're right, but we need to make sure not to not say it. Yeah. Schools, absolutely. We could do 2 hours, 3 hours, 8 hours on schools. We have a paper on mixed income schools and community change. If you look that up, it was in Education and Society, where we map out some conceptual frameworks around exactly your question. There needs to be more studies on it. Do you want to
And
hear
we
about
have
that?
the youth scan.
Yes, we have our third scan of the field is on youth, and so we're going to be talking about youth and mixed income developments, including what happened in their schools. Taryn Grass, it's sitting on her to-do list right now. She's like, get that. But it'll be coming out, so we're excited about that. How communities form. We just had a conversation yesterday with the program officer, Robert Wood Johnson, social dynamics research inquiry, where we're going to pause and slow down a little bit and ask questions about social capital, social ties, social networks, social isolation. Like, what do these things mean? How are they different? And when you connect them with socioeconomic diversity, what happens? And when you ask the question of leading to well-being and health, what happens? And so we're doing some evidence mapping around that. So we really are kind of slowing ourselves down to have a better answer to your question. We know some things, we don't know as much as we should. And hardest to house. The way this connects is that, sadly, these mixed income transformation take folks who are living in a precarious situation and often make it even harder for them. It's generating homelessness. Right now in San Francisco, it's great to work in some progressive places. They've just made $1 million fund available for those residents who are in danger of being evicted because that mixed income transformation is coming and they're not able to abide by whatever those regulations will be. So they made a fund available to prevent homelessness. Because if you look at other places, it's actually creating that. So there really is a link between, at least that's one of many links. Certainly these are hoping to be part of the solution, but they can also be part of the problem, and we need to pay attention to that.
Amy, last word?
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time. I hope you walk out of here with a sense of inspiration and hope of your own personal transformation and organizational and policy transformations that we can build together. So got a lot of work to do.
Well, you stole my last word. Thank you both so much.